West of Canton, Ohio, lies a beautiful natural lake. Modest older homes and new condominiums line its shores. And an atmosphere of tranquility prevails here. Meyers Lake is a peaceful, quiet lake. Today, it's hard for a stranger to picture it as ever being anything else. But to many thousands of people, the mention of Meyers Lake brings back very special memories. Memories of a time when the lake echoed with laughter. Happy screams mingled with the roar of a roller coaster. The music of the merry-go-round and the crackling voice of the laughing lady. The air was filled with the fragrance from thousands of petunias. Sunlight glinted from spinning rocket ships. The smell of cotton candy and caramel corn mingled with the crisp electric odor of the Dodgem cars. And at night, the dances, the romances under the stars, the big bands. Yes, mention Meyers Lake to tens of thousands of people, and they will remember Meyers Lake Park. Long before there were rides or even a park at Meyers Lake, the natural beauty of the area was an attraction. Centuries before European settlers discovered the lake, native Indians camped, fished, and hunted around it. In the early 1800s, one of Canton's founding fathers, Bezaleel Wells, became the first settler to claim the lake. It was then called Wells Lake, until 1817, when Andrew Meyer, a Baltimore businessman, bought the lake from Wells and gave it the name that it bears to this day. The lake remained relatively secluded until after the Civil War. Canton boomed in the years following the war, and people started coming out to the lake to escape the growing pressures of city life. By 1879, the lake had become so popular that Joseph Meyer, Andrew Meyer's grandson, built the Lake Park Hotel on the north end of the lake. In the 1880s, a second hotel, the Lake View, was erected by Edward J. Meyer on the east shore of the lake. It was Edward who initiated development of the amusement park, which was called Lakeview Park in the early years. By the turn of the century, the area was so popular that families would often camp at the lake for the entire summer. Men could commute to work on the street railway, while their families escaped the summer heat on the shaded shores of Meyers Lake. The Lake Park Hotel burned in 1892 and was immediately rebuilt. The new hotel and casino became the Lakeside Country Club in 1903. And for many years, the lavish club was a gathering place for Canton's social elite. Lakeview Park prospered, And the number of visitors to Meyers Lake grew each year, to the point that on busy days the electric trolley cars ran one every 3 minutes to the park. People came to swim, or to row out on the lake, to stroll along the shaded paths, or to try out the rides in the park. An occasional visitor to the lake and the park in the 1890s was Canton's own William McKinley, President of the United States. In 1902, the Northern Ohio Traction and Light Company bought Meyers Lake Park. In those days, it was common for trolley and streetcar companies to own amusement parks as a means of increasing the number of passengers on their lines, especially on the weekends. The NOT&L company would own Meyers Lake Park for the next 24 years and would turn it into one of the premier parks in Ohio. In the first few years alone, the company spent over $100,000 on the park, and Meyers Lake eventually became the largest of 6 parks owned by the Traction Company. The company added rides, built a new bathhouse, and a large theater. For the next 20 years, the 1,200-seat Lake Park Theater was one of the greatest attractions in the park. Some of the most famous vaudeville acts of the day performed here. Buster Keaton appeared here in 1910. Perhaps the most memorable performance took place when the Marx Brothers almost literally brought the house down while performing in a raging thunderstorm. At one point, the storm reportedly grew so fierce that it rocked the entire building. Fearing the building would collapse, the audience quickly fled. In typical style, the Marx Brothers headed out the nearest window. The toboggan slide had been a popular way for park goers to get wet, but it was soon eclipsed by the much larger Shoot the Chutes. You were guaranteed to get a good soaking on this ride. The popularity of the park eventually led to the construction of a boardwalk bridge connecting the park with the Lakeside Country Club across the lake. Now, guests at the club could stroll across the lake whenever they wished, without waiting for a boat or going around the lake. In the years before World War I, crowds flocked to Meyers Lake Park every summer. Park-goers could ride the wicker gondolas of the Circle Swing, or stroll along the Pike, as the park's midway was called. Attractions along the Pike included a fun house, a Ferris wheel, a penny arcade, and even a small theater that played those newfangled moving pictures. You could have your own picture taken at Edgel's photo booth, or fire a few rounds at the shooting gallery. For a while, there were roller coasters at both ends of the Pike. On holidays and special occasions, the night sky above the park was lit up by fireworks, a tradition that would continue for the life of Meyers Lake Park. And so the park grew. In the summers, people came to swim in the cool lake waters, or bask in the warm summer sunshine. And if it got too hot, you could stop by for a cool beer in the Hofbrau, located next to the roller rink. The dance hall was popular. Over the years, rides came and went. However, by the 1920s, the NOT&L, as with streetcar companies all across the country, was losing interest in amusement parks. As more and more people drove cars, trolley business declined. By 1926, the company was looking to get out of the amusement park business altogether. It was common practice for park owners to lease space in their parks to private vendors and concession owners. In fact, Many of the major rides in amusement parks were often built and owned by private operators. In the early 20s, several of the rides at Meyers Lake belonged to George Sinclair Amusement Company. George and his son Carl had gained a national reputation for their fine roller coasters. For a time, the Sinclair family even lived in an apartment built into the scenic railway, the coaster that they owned at Meyers Lake. In 1926, the Sinclairs took over the operation of Meyers Lake Park from the streetcar company. Forming the Meyers Lake Park Company, the Sinclair family would own the park for the remainder of its days. Over the winter of 1926-1927, the Sinclairs completely remodeled the park. Almost all of the old rides and buildings and concessions were demolished to make way for the new Meyers Lake Park. They spent nearly $250,000 during the first year. By the opening of the 1927 season, the park was almost completely rebuilt, taking on the appearance that most people remember today. 20,000 people flocked to the new Meyers Lake Park on May 21st, 1927, opening day. In addition to all of the new rides, two of the biggest attractions were Monkey Island and the Zoological Gardens. The Sinclairs had planned to build one of the largest and best zoos in the state at Meyers Lake Park, and the Zoological Gardens were just the first phase. Unfortunately, the expense of maintaining the zoo, plus Ohio's harsh winters, eventually doomed this idea, and the zoo only lasted about 8 years. Monkey Island remained until the 1940s, when the monkeys were removed and the island was converted into a fountain.
A lot of people thought that Monkey Island was a little crude, but it was really and truly entertainment. People sat by the hour to watch the monkeys. So there came a Monday, and the boss said, "Bob, we have a problem." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The monkeys got off on Sunday night." "Oh, they're up in North Park Avenue." "What happened, boss?" "Somebody put a plank across, a 2x6, and the monkeys got off. They went to North Park Avenue, and they got into some of the homes, and they're eating the wallpaper. They love paste." Well, it so happens that we didn't have any monkey insurance. So, what are you going to do? We finally appealed to the people, and they came along with us. That was the beginning of Petunia Island.
In addition to the permanent features of the park, special events and temporary attractions were also popular, such as hot air balloons, or an Indian encampment with real Indians. The crowds loved it. Here we see a typical crowd enjoying a picnic at the park. Of course, swimming remained as popular as ever. Beauty pageants also became a regular attraction at Meyers Lake Park. Meet Miss Canton, 1927. This unique structure is the Toadstool Bandstand. It was the first patented bandstand in America. As the decades passed, the park slowly evolved into the Meyers Lake so fondly remembered by thousands today. Ah, the rides that so many of us remember and loved. Here we see the dashing Dodgem in the early 40s. To the park's very end, the Dodgem cars would remain a favorite for thousands of youngsters. The 480-foot-long picnic shelter, built on the side of the old pike, could seat over 6,000 people. A second-floor balcony ran the length of the building and provided excellent views of the park and the lake. At least 2 different Ferris wheels came to the park over the years. Here we see the Old Mill, a water ride. Its long, dark tunnel made it a special favorite for couples on dates. A rather strange but popular attraction in the early Sinclair years was Bluebeard's Castle, a walk-through attraction depicting the life of Bluebeard. The two giant bizarre heads that made up the castle were certainly unusual, to say the least. And not to forget the little folk. There were fun rides for the kiddies at Meyers Lake Park. Here we see the Custer cars, powered by batteries. The mainstays of any amusement park are the roller coasters, and the coasters at Meyers Lake Park were among the best anywhere. This is the Skyrocket, which thrilled thousands of happy riders in the 30s and the 40s. And so the crowds flocked to Meyers Lake Park for decades. The flying scooters, also called the Butterfly, were especially popular because of the control that the rider had over the ride. For many years, the Midway echoed with the voice of Red Miller, who owned the Guess Your Weight and the age booths. Throughout its history, the economic lifeblood of Meyers Lake Park was the company picnic. Companies like Hoover and Goodyear, along with trade unions, civic and community groups, regularly booked group picnics at the park. During its heyday, Meyers Lake averaged almost one company picnic a day. Some of these companies would bring up to 20,000 people for the day. And almost everyone today who remembers the park at all will recall the games and the contests, the fireworks and dancing that were all part of that special summer day's festivities. As you can imagine, competition to book these picnics was fierce among the amusement parks in the region.
Would go up there, they would have representatives from Chippewa, Idora Park, Euclid Beach, Sandusky, and we'd all sit in a room. Everybody had their day in court, so to speak. And it so happens I was fortunate enough that I would come out with a day in court with a good decision. And it wasn't meant a cutthroat thing. We were selling quality. We weren't selling price. We were selling quality. You come to us, we'll pay. We had a beautiful park. Didn't have to take a back seat to anybody. We had hanging flower baskets. We had cleanliness. Cleanliness is the greatest thing in the world.
As the years passed, generations of Canton residents, as well as thousands from throughout the region, spent many a long, hazy day at beautiful Meyers Lake Park. If the hustle and bustle of the park got to be too much, you could always take an excursion into the lake itself. The motor launch June Ann operated on the lake for decades. Possibly the best remembered ride in the park's history was built in the winter of 1947 and 1948. There had been several roller coasters in the park over the years. Long before they took over the park, the Sinclairs had owned the Scenic Railway, later called the Blue Streak. Crowds in the 30s and 40s thrilled to the coaster called the Skyrocket. While these had all been fine rides, they paled in comparison to the heart-stopping 47-degree, 85-foot plunge of the first hill on the new coaster. But enough of dull statistics. Sit tight, keep your hands inside the car, and hold on. We're going for a ride on the Comet. wail, the roar, and the screams of the comet would echo in the memories of park goers for the rest of the park's days. Although it wasn't a huge coaster, the Comet gave you a world-class ride. Even today, most people who remember it still agree you either loved the Comet or you only rode it once. Of course, if you weren't quite up for the Comet, you could practice on the kiddie coaster. Well, by the early 1950s, the park looked pretty much as it would until its demise in 1974. The Sinclairs loved flowers, and much of the park was landscaped into a beautiful garden setting. For many, the most vivid memory of Meyers Lake Park is the beautiful floral borders and the scent of petunias drifting on the summer breeze. For hundreds of thousands of people in northeastern Ohio and even beyond, summertime in their childhood meant trips to Meyers Lake Park. Let's pay a visit to the park as it was in the 50s. Remember those long days of innocence at Kiddieland? And what about the rockets? They were brought to Meyers Lake Park in the 40s, sweeping gracefully out over the lake. How the sun sparkled on those sleek stainless steel sides. Want to try the beach? How about lounging in the sun, splashing in the lake? Or perhaps you tried your skill on the miniature golf course. How good were you at the arcade? If your luck wasn't holding, you could always go to the duck pond. A winner every time. Take a place in line and have fun in the Laugh in the Dark. And be sure to say hi to the laughing lady. Did you ever wonder where she got that laugh? Well, the story goes that back in the 30s, the people in charge of coming up with her laugh took a retired opera singer out on the town, piled her liberally with alcohol, and told her off-color jokes, all the time recording her laughs. Flowers, flowers, flowers everywhere. Unless you knew the park in its early years, bet you didn't realize that this fountain used to be Monkey Island. And who can forget the merry-go-round? The old merry-go-round burned in 1939 and was replaced by this magnificent Stein and Goldstein ride. With its enchanting Wurlitzer organ and 48 hand-carved stallions. Without a doubt, this was the most beautiful and charming ride in the entire park. It is said that at one time the bellows on the organ gave out, and a good old-fashioned, old reliable Hoover vacuum cleaner came to the rescue. Running in reverse, the Hoover sweeper kept the organ operating until the bellows could be fixed. We're happy to say that this grand old ride survives today, bringing joy to visitors at Bushnell Park in Hartford, Connecticut. Well, what visit to Meyers Lake was complete without stuffing yourself on cotton candy or custard? With 12% butterfat content, the frozen custard at Meyers Lake Park was the richest and creamiest anywhere. Really hungry? Well, you could eat in the cafeteria or the Lakeshore Restaurant after it opened in 1961, either indoors or out. Yes, in those balmy summer days of the 50s, the parking lots at Meyers Lake Park were nearly always full. Hey, remember the bug? It twirled thousands from the time it was installed in the 30s until the day the park closed. And who can forget the smell and the sound of the Dodgem cars? After you had your teeth jarred a few times, did you ever wonder why they were called Dodgem cars when Ram-em cars was a more accurate description? Hi Hi Calypso, the last major ride to be installed at Meyers Lake. The Calypso was one of the only 3 in the country when it was installed in 1962. It was so popular that it paid for itself the very first season. But for all the park's daytime excitement, for all those thousands of young at heart, the real magic of Meyers Lake began when the sun went down. It might not be stretching the truth too much to say that a goodly portion of Canton's post-war baby boom grew out of romances that began in the Moonlight Ballroom and Moonlight Gardens. For more than half a century, the Moonlight Ballroom and the open-air Moonlight Gardens at Meyers Lake Park were among the most romantic spots in the Midwest. In those golden years of the 30s and 40s, when jazz and the big bands were king, the Moonlight Ballroom was often swinging 7 nights a week. Nearly every big-name band in the country played there at one time or another. The Dorsey Brothers, Harry James, Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and Rudy Valley. The list goes on and on. Legend has it that Guy Lombardo got his start in the Moonlight Ballroom. The big band era at the ballroom reached its zenith in 1942, when a record crowd of 4,500 people packed the house to listen and dance to the music of Glenn Miller and his orchestra. How many of you recall your senior prom at the Moonlight Ballroom? And what could be more romantic than dancing under the stars at the Moonlight Gardens? Moonlight shimmering on the lake, the soft scent of petunias drifting on the breeze, the gentle glow of lights on the face of that someone special that you're holding oh so close. And the band plays on. By day, the Moonlight Gardens were often used for special attractions and shows. The 45-foot band shell with its neon filigree lighting was destroyed by a storm in the 50s and was replaced by this simpler stage. Really, the entire park had its own magic in the night. When the lights came on, it was like a different world at Meyers Lake. But for all of its popularity, By the late 50s and early 60s, Meyers Lake Park was in decline. The crowds were growing thinner each year. A different economic climate, changing public interests, all contributed to the decline of Meyers Lake Park. Fewer companies could afford to sponsor employee picnics in the 60s, and those who could were often lured away by the larger theme parks. The days when Meyers Lake Park could count on several picnics a week were gone forever.
Now, the lifeblood of the park like we had out there, a small park, what they used to call it, park at the end of the streetcar line, were weekend industrial picnics. Now, we had picnics from as far away as Mansfield and Akron and Cleveland and Zanesville, Cambridge, and so forth, but they were all weekend, Saturday, Sunday picnics. And gradually, as these parks, these other super parks became larger, they started taking the picnics away from us. They had more rides, they had more concessions, they could handle more.
But even in the later years, special events could still draw big crowds to the park. The lake itself had always been an attraction, and in the 60s, Meyers Lake hosted 2 National Water Ski Association championships. Some of the last big crowds to come to Meyers Lake were there for the water shows. Over 100,000 people lined the lake shores in August of 1968 to be treated to a truly world-class ski championship. Meyers Lake Park even made it into the Guinness Book of World Records. A publicity effort by the park and a local radio station led to a world record-setting roller coaster marathon in 1972. 31 hours, 32 minutes on the Comet. That's 1,075 times around the track, non-stop. But in a way, there was a certain desperation apparent in these last-ditch attempts to draw the crowds back to the park. In the end, they all failed. Like the old saying, what goes up must come down. After nearly a century, Meyers Lake Park came down. In 1974, Meyers Lake Park closed its gates forever. There would be no more rides on the Comet, no more swirling rocket ships, and never again would the aroma of cotton candy and popcorn entice small hands to give up their week's allowance for that great taste. Sadly, weeds would claim the flower beds. The clack of the roller coaster, the music of the merry-go-round, and the outbursts of the laughing lady became only memories. For a brief time, it appeared that perhaps one legacy of the park would survive. In 1977, the Moonlight Ballroom was purchased and renovated by a local developer. It reopened in 1978 and for a few months the wonderful sounds of the big bands once more drifted out of the ballroom. Perhaps lingering as a faint whisper in the wind over the weed-choked fields where once there had been a very special amusement park. Over the fall and winter of 1978, as the word spread, the crowds returned to the Moonlight Ballroom. On January 6, 1979, 1,700 nostalgic music lovers flocked there to listen and dance to the sounds of the Glenn Miller Orchestra. It was the biggest crowd yet at this new ballroom, and it promised even better things to come. The band played well into the morning, and as the happy but weary guests finally headed home, they left vowing to return again, knowing that Meyers Lake was still magic. Before dawn the next day, the Moonlight Ballroom had burned to the ground. And so it was over. All the laughter, all the excitement, all the sights, the sounds, the smells, and the magic that had been Meyers Lake Park were gone forever. Meyers Lake today is a quiet, peaceful place. And when the sun sets here now, it's hard to picture a time when the night sky was filled with fireworks and reflected the joys of throngs of happy park-goers. But it did happen. And it was all true. And the park lives on. The magic is there in the hearts of those who remember.
Remember is a place from long ago. Remember, filled with everything you know. Remember when you're sad and feeling down. Remember, turn around. Remember, life is just a memory. Remember, close your eyes and you can see.